Imagine the ideal enduro motorcycle. Lightweight with a powerful and torquey engine, excellent suspension, a low center of gravity, easy to handle, innovative and at the same time reliable. It may seem that some things in the previous sentence are hardly compatible. However, in 2007 such a motorcycle was attempted to be created by the Bavarians and they practically succeeded. This model was called Ona. It is truly unique in its class, and some of the solutions implemented in this motorcycle were later used in other machines. Let's get to know the history of this motorcycle in more detail. By the way, this is a story of big ambitions. You are on the CrossMoto channel. Enjoy watching. Let's start with the history. Until 2007, the company didn't produce anything like this, while European and Japanese motorcycle manufacturers had already succeeded in building powerful enduro and motocross machines. They produced their signature boxer engines, invented the class of large touring enduros in the 80s with a certain model, and carried out a landmark experiment with non-standard inline engines placed in the frame. In the models 1075 in 1993, a single-cylinder mid-displacement engine called 10 was created. The first motorcycle with a chain drive to the rear wheel after the complete transition to shaft drive in the 60s. There was nothing like aggressive lightweight enduro bikes in the company's production lineup. And then came 2007. That year BMW bought Husqvarna motorcycles from Augusta Motor, which belonged to the Cagiva Corporation. And despite having significant experience in the field of light off-road sports vehicles, the management made an ambitious decision to build the perfect enduro motorcycle from scratch. The bosses had a huge desire to break into the enduro racing niche right away. With excellent equipment capable of competing on par with the best representatives of the class, like the Japanese Big Four and KTM, and thus raising the prestige of the brand. From a marketing point of view, it was positioned as a sports machine for enduro trials and as a dual-purpose motorcycle. The project for a 4-stroke enduro in the 450cc class was born after a failure. Model G650. The 650 was produced from 2006 to 2009 in both supermoto and roadster versions. It was a response to the growing popularity of mid-displacement bikes in the 2000s and the evolution of previous 650 models. All three models were equipped with an Austrian engine, and many features of this motorcycle were developed jointly with an Italian company. The 650, despite a lot of innovations, did not meet sales expectations, and it was time for a new project where they didn't want to repeat past mistakes. In a short time frame, the new motorcycle was ready. The engineers tried to achieve power more or less comparable to competitors, made the motorcycle lighter, a bit more compact, and used a number of unconventional technical solutions. It debuted in front of the public for the first time on November 6, 2007 at the 2007 exhibition in Milan. And now let's take a closer look at the construction of this enduro. The first thing that catches your eye is the frame. It's not like the aluminum delta box used by the Japanese, or the K-Team frame made of chromolybdenum steel. They used a tubular stainless steel construction. The frame was extremely rigid and, due to the few tubes, simple and quite light. During the design process of the motorcycle, the engineers realized that because of the rather large airbox, it wouldn't be possible to place the fuel tank in the same spot as on most motorcycles. They squeezed the tank under the seat, which also helped to lower the center of mass. Engine. The Bavarians developed a 450cc 4-valve single-cylinder engine from scratch, but the production of the power unit was handed over to another company, the Taiwanese Kymco. You can notice that the engine cylinder is noticeably tilted forward, specifically by 30 degrees. This was done intentionally to lower the motorcycle's center of mass, and naturally the development of the frame, chassis and engine were coordinated. The tilt of the engine also made it possible to increase the space for installing a dual-throttle body injector and a larger air filter box. This also had a positive effect on the shape of the intake tract. A few standard specifications: single-cylinder 4-stroke engine, displacement of 449 cubic centimeters, cylinder bore of 98 millimeters, piston stroke of 59.6 millimeters, compression ratio, 2 overhead camshafts, and 4 valves per cylinder. This engine could boast a power output of 51 to 57 horsepower at 9,000 revolutions per minute in the sports version and 40.8 horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute. The civilian version's maximum torque was 44 and 43 Newton meters respectively. It was noticeably restricted to meet emission standards. Fans who wanted to unlock the full potential of the engine didn't have much to be upset about, since with just a few minutes of tinkering with the electronics, an experienced mechanic could unleash the hidden 11 horsepower. The engine was powered by a Japanese-made injector. A 5-speed gearbox was located in the same unit as the engine. From the non-standard features. First, the engine's crankshaft was made to rotate in the opposite direction of the wheels. The point here is the gyroscopic moment. A similar solution allows the motorcycle to change direction faster in turns, and it also noticeably loads the front wheel, which in theory has a positive effect on the bike's handling. To transmit the required direction of rotation to the gearbox, an intermediate shaft was needed. Secondly, the clutch assembly also turned out to be unconventional. Due to the layout of the frame and engine, there was no room left for it on the gearbox's primary shaft. Therefore, the engineers decided to place the clutch directly on the crankshaft on the right side. The clutch turned out to be of a small diameter, and due to its location, it rotated at a higher speed than on machines with a traditional layout, about 3 times faster. This resulted in one unpleasant drawback: the clutch wears out noticeably faster. Traditionally, 2 side radiators are used in cross and enduro bikes for the cooling system. Thanks to the engine tilt and the absence of a fuel tank here, they installed a single radiator. Take another look at the motorcycle frame. As you can see, compared to competitors, the mounting point of the rear wheel swing arm to the frame is shifted forward. Consequently, to keep the wheelbase within the class limits, the swing arm itself had to be made longer. And at a certain stage of development, the engineers decided to address one unpleasant issue that occurs with the chain, which is especially noticeable on bikes with a long wheel travel. On nearly all motorcycles, including enduro bikes, the gearbox output shaft axis, where the front sprocket is mounted, doesn't align with the swing arm pivot axis. We also have a third point, the wheel axle. It corresponds to the axis of the rear sprocket, and due to the suspension movement, the distance between the front and rear sprockets changes, which affects the slack and tension of the chain. Engineers introduced an innovation. They combined the axis of the secondary shaft with the swing arm axis, thereby eliminating the factor of chain tension or slack and reducing the load on the gearbox. However, pursuing perfection has made replacing the front sprocket more complex, requiring the removal of the swing arm. The company officially stated that despite the complication of the process, an experienced mechanic can perform this operation in 15 minutes. By the way, it was for the first time on a production machine that the sprocket axle and the swing arm were combined. As for the chassis, the best components were used here: a 45mm fork with a travel of 300mm, a monoshock, which together with the long swing arm provided a rear wheel travel of up to 320mm. Brake system. It didn't turn out to be a traditional motorcycle. A concept came out, for which we had to adapt individual units and parts, sometimes in a very unconventional way. As a result, he ended up with one of the lightest motorcycles in the class with just a couple or 3 horsepower, above and a number of innovations nearby. The year 2008 arrived, and the equipment went on sale, and it was time for the company to present it in races. And this happened in 2009. And at this point, the narrative could quite logically be expected. What can I say, guys? It turned out interesting, but the construction was raw. Something broke down, and the motorcycle didn't win the race. Considering the novelty and innovation of some of the solutions, it definitely had a place to be. But it turned out a bit differently. And this is a bright part of the hard enduro history from the year 2009. Andreas Lettenbichler took first place in the prestigious and not yet as difficult as today enduro event, and second place at Erzberg in Austria. Technically, no 4-stroke motorcycle had ever taken such a high position in this enduro challenge. And they also signed a contract with enduro racing legend David Knight at the beginning of 2009. And that's when the mishaps began. Knight, who just a couple of years ago on KTM was the winner in all 14 enduro championships, takes 7th place in his first race. The issue was with the suspension setup, which was unusual for the rider. He insisted on replacing the fork with one he was more used to, but the engineers stubbornly refused to do it. David insisted that the motorcycle is good off-road, but for racing and for him specifically, a special racing series is absolutely necessary. In general, conflicts between the riders and the engineers were flaring up within the team. Knight and the other riders suggested ideas on how to improve the results in the races and how to help promote the motorcycle. And this ran up against the engineers and the company management, who of course knew best how to create and promote the technology. Don't think that the designers are jerks. No, the guys did everything they could to create an excellent enduro motorcycle. And in theory, most of their decisions should have had a positive impact on the quality of riding the motorcycle. You can understand them when a constantly complaining racer approaches, but Nate had a valid reason for complaining. For example, the system of constant and even chain tension. In theory, it offered several benefits, but in practice, the rear of the motorcycle was unloaded due to this solution, making the handling less predictable. Overall, the handling was specific, and naturally, athletes who had spent several years riding bikes from other brands had to adapt and retrain themselves. But this is not the biggest problem. In one of the first races of the season, David noticed that he was leading quite easily, overcoming obstacles where it seemed the motorcycle should have been a burden. Knight was close to the finish line, and no one could stop him from winning, no one except his motorcycle. The clutch burned out, which ruined his lead, and in the following races, similar events became an annoying pattern. Remember, I said the clutch spins 3 times faster, start with the chain slipping. On a KTM, it wouldn't have been so critical, and he would have finished the race, but with the rotation speed. It burned up as fast as gunpowder. In the end, that's how it was. David was told that he crashed the motorcycle in the pit and broke it right in front of the management. The company's racers parted ways, with Juha Salminen, another team rider, who took second place in another competition in the mid-2000s. The thing is perhaps that Salminen turned out to have more patience. He spoke unfavorably about the clutch and handling, but still, thanks to his persistence, he was able to adapt to the features of the new motorcycle, another crucial factor that swayed everything. The team received new motorcycles for testing literally right before the first race of the season, and the tests were conducted without the participation of competing brands' equipment. Now this mistake seems obvious, but back then the racing team didn't pay much attention to it. By the end of 2009, they still made a number of changes to the motorcycle. They removed the system with constant chain tension and modified the frame a bit. This enabled the motorcycle to perform well in a few races. The BMW G450X was doomed to fail, and by the end of 2009 this was especially noticeable. This story may seem quite complicated, but in reality it's simple. 5. They wanted to create an innovative motorcycle. During the development, the engineers had to work on the motorcycle's quirks, coming up with new quirks. It turned into a vicious cycle. In theory, it was supposed to become perfect, but in reality it turned out strange. The racers realized the following fact. Why spend a year or even 2 retraining for this motorcycle just to achieve the same results they already had with their previous machines? Or, for example, it could have turned out to be a very decent dual sport, but for this niche, its 8-liter tank was frankly too small. Stories from journalists didn't help either, providing praise at most. That it was on par with its competitors, but for sales, that's not very good. In 2010, the management made the decision to stop production. As David Knight said, if they had followed the standard path of building an Enduro, they would have ended up with a very decent machine. But, having no experience in building in this niche, they went down the path of innovation for the sake of innovation. That's the story of a cruel joke played on the machine, my friends. The story of how the Bavarians reinvented the Enduro motorcycle. And even though this motorcycle didn't achieve great success and its production was quickly discontinued, some of the technical solutions implemented in it remain interesting and in demand to this day. At this point, my story comes to an end. As usual, friends, if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to show your support by subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting. I would especially like to thank everyone who supports my channel financially using the details provided in the description. This is the CrossMoto channel. See you next time.